C'est là ta dernière chance. Tu ne pourras plus faire marche arrière. Choisis la pilule bleue et tout s'arrête. Après, tu pourras faire de beaux rêves et penser ce que tu veux. Choisis la pilule rouge, tu restes au pays des merveilles. Et on descend avec le lapin blanc au fond du gouffre. N'oublie pas, je ne t'offre que la vérité, rien de plus.
We're all talking about something here which isn't happening. I've heard time and time again members here talk of CO2 as a pollutant. A pollutant is a life-giving natural gas. It gives me the impression that some of our members haven't had the benefit of a formal education. Isn't this really just about the state being able to get its hand in ordinary people's trouser pocket to steal yet more tax from them? Isn't this all about political control? Isn't all this about politics and big business? The whole thing's a sham. This bogus hypothesis, this ridiculous nonsense that man-made CO2 is causing global warming. Enough, please, before we damage irrevocably the global economy.
Qui font la une dans de nombreuses régions. Une terrible sécheresse est en train de s'installer.
Nous ignorons à quel point le climat va ou pourrait changer dans l'avenir.
Après plus d'une semaine d'inondations, on compte 72 victimes dans le centre et l'est de l'Europe et l'ouest de la Russie.
Nous ne savons pas à quelle vitesse se fera ce changement, ni même si nos actions pourront y remédier.
Matin, on y ramassait des corps dans les...
En Inde, des pluies torrentielles sans précédent ont déclenché les pires inondations que le pays ait jamais connues. Au sud de la Californie, des milliers de pompiers se battent contre un nouveau gigantesque incendie.
La canicule est là, l'Arizona même connaît une vague de
chaleur. Frappée par des tornades qui ont fait plusieurs victimes. La Nouvelle-Orléans n'est plus une ville sûre. C'est aussi simple et aussi...
L'enfer et l'eau ne font qu'un encore aujourd'hui dans une ville prise dans une étreinte totale, accablée par une catastrophe sans précédent.
Il est évident maintenant que la Nouvelle-Orléans est devenue une...
N'est-ce pas étonnant de penser que ce sont les hommes qui, en faisant le plein d'essence ou en allumant la lumière, commandent le climat?
Man-made global warming is no longer just a theory about climate. It is the defining moral and political cause of our age. Campaigners say the time for debate is over. Any criticism, no matter how scientifically rigorous, is illegitimate, even worse, dangerous. But in this film, it will be shown that the Earth's climate is always changing, that there is nothing unusual about the current temperature, and that the scientific evidence does not support the notion that climate is driven by carbon dioxide, man-made or otherwise. Everywhere you are told that man-made climate change is proved beyond doubt. But you are being told lies.
The whole thing stinks.
This is the story of how a theory about climate turned into a political ideology. Theory of man-made global warming is now so firmly entrenched, the voices of opposition so effectively silenced, it seems invincible, untroubled by any contrary evidence, no matter how strong. The global warming alarm is now beyond reason.
Particularly when you have, for example, the chief scientist of the UK telling people that by the end of the century, the only habitable place on the Earth will be the Antarctic. And humanity may survive thanks to some breeding couples who move to the Antarctic. I mean, this is hilarious. It would be hilarious, actually, if it weren't so sad.
Now, the Prime Minister's back from his holidays, unrepentant and unembarrassed about yet another.
Each day, the news reports grow more fantastically apocalyptic. Politicians no longer dare to express any doubt about climate change.
There is such intolerance of any dissenting voice.
Are some of the worst climate criminals on the planet.
This is the most politically incorrect thing possible, is to doubt this climate change orthodoxy.
Global warming has gone beyond politics. It is a new kind of morality.
If we look at climate through the geological time frame, we would never suspect CO2 as a major climate driver.
None of the major climate changes in the last 1,000 years can be explained by CO2.
We can't say that CO2 will drive climate. It certainly never did in the past.
I've often heard it said that there is a consensus of thousands of scientists on the global warming issue and that humans are causing a catastrophic change to the climate system. Well, I am one scientist, and there are many that simply think that is not true. That is not
this
true.
This claim that the IPCC is the world's top 1,500 or 2,500 scientists, you look at the bibliographies of the people, and it's simply not true. There are quite a number of non-scientists.
And to build the number up to 2,500, they have to start taking reviewers and government people and so on, anyone who ever came close to them. And none of them are asked to agree. Many of them disagree.
Those people who are specialists but don't agree with the polemic and resign, and there have been a number that I know of, they are simply put on the author list and become part of this 2,500 of the world's top scientists.
People have decided you have to convince other people that since no scientist disagrees, you shouldn't disagree either. But that, whenever you hear that in science, that's pure propaganda.
Imagine that we live in an age of reason. And the global warming alarm is dressed up as science, but it's not science, it's propaganda.
La catastrophe serait, elle, d'origine humaine, à 90% sûre.
Ce 2 février 2007 va rester dans l'histoire comme le jour où on a supprimé le point d'interrogation.
L'augmentation de l'intensité des cyclones, typhons et ouragans. L'homme, s'il le veut, peut encore limiter les dégâts.
Les scientifiques ne peuvent pas faire plus, sauf que sur un point, il y a quelque chose de positif pour eux. Ils sont tous d'accord.
Man-made global warming is no ordinary scientific theory.
This morning, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change made up of...
It is presented in the media as having the stamp of authority of an impressive international organization.
From the IPCC,
the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC.
In about 50 years' time, the climate may be a few degrees warmer than today. We just don't know.
I believe that the nations of the world themselves are impressed with the evidence that we have amassed.
One of the most important statements you should be prepared to make as a believer is, I don't know.
Alors le GIEC a été critiqué parce qu'il y a eu effectivement quelques petites erreurs qui ont été trouvées, ce qui est peu quand on regarde la manière dont le GIEC est organisé. C'est-à-dire que c'est essentiellement un travail bénévole qui est organisé par un secrétariat tout petit. Il y avait 5 personnes, et puis une dizaine ensuite. Les moyens qui sont mis dans le GIEC sont très faibles.
Quand j'ai démissionné du GIEC, j'ai cru que l'affaire était classée, jusqu'à ce que je constate que mon nom figurait encore sur l'avant-projet. J'ai donc demandé qu'il soit retiré. On m'a dit que j'avais contribué à l'écrire et que par conséquent, il y resterait. J'ai répondu que je n'y avais pas vraiment contribué puisqu'on n'avait pas transcrit ce que je disais. Enfin, ça a été un vrai combat jusqu'à ce que je les menace de poursuites juridiques et qu'ils finissent par enlever mon nom. Et je ne suis pas le seul à qui ce soit arrivé. Je connais un certain nombre de personnes, de vrais spécialistes qui, n'étant pas d'accord avec la polémique, ont démissionné et qui malgré tout sont restés dans la liste des auteurs et sont entrés parmi les fameux 2500 meilleurs scientifiques du monde.
Dans une lettre ouverte au Wall Street Journal, l'ex-président de l'Académie nationale américaine des sciences, le professeur Frederick Seitz, révèle que le GIEC a bien censuré les commentaires de certains scientifiques. Il écrit « Ce rapport n'est pas conforme à la version approuvée par les scientifiques ayant contribué à sa rédaction ». De fait, plus de 15 points importants du chapitre scientifique ont été supprimés. Comme par exemple, aucune étude n'a pu prouver de façon définitive que l'on pouvait attribuer les changements climatiques aux gaz à effet de serre. Ou encore, à ce jour, aucune étude ne peut dire que l'homme est totalement ou même en partie responsable des changements climatiques observés. Et le professeur Seitz de conclure, jamais je n'ai constaté une violation aussi alarmante des règles de la déontologie que celle dont témoignent les événements qui ont abouti au rapport du GIEC. En retour, le GIEC ne nie pas avoir supprimé des articles, tout en certifiant que cela n'a pas été fait par malhonnêteté ou parti pris, et affirme que, par ailleurs, les incertitudes sur les causes du réchauffement global ont été conservées. Les modifications auraient été apportées suite à des remarques faites par certains gouvernements, par des scientifiques indépendants et par des ONG. Les rapports officiels émis par le GIEC sont souvent très alarmants. Mais sont-ils fiables ?
Je suis persuadé que nous assistons à un changement climatique induit par l'homme. We are told that the Earth's climate is changing. But the Earth's climate is always changing. In Earth's long history, there have been countless periods when it was much warmer and much cooler than it is today, when much of the world was covered by tropical forests or else vast ice sheets. The climate has always changed, and changed without any help from us humans. Climate variation in the past is clearly natural. So why do we think it's any different today? In the current alarm about global warming, the culprit is industrial society. Thanks to modern industry, luxuries once enjoyed exclusively by the rich are now available in abundance to ordinary people. Novel technologies have made life easier and richer. Modern transport and communications have made the world seem less foreign and distant. Industrial progress has changed our lives. But has it also changed the climate? According to the theory of man-made global warming, industrial growth should cause the temperature to rise. But does it?
Anyone who goes around and says that carbon dioxide is responsible for most of the warming of the 20th century hasn't looked at the basic numbers.
So how does the industrial story compare with the temperature record? Since the mid-19th century, the Earth's temperature has risen by just over 0.5 degrees Celsius. But this warming began long before cars and planes were even invented. What's more, most of the rise in temperature occurred before 1940, during a period when industrial production was relatively insignificant. After the Second World War, during the post-war economic boom, temperatures, in theory, should have shot up. But they didn't. They fell. not for 1 or 2 years, but for 4 decades. In fact, paradoxically, it wasn't until the world economic recession in the 1970s that they stopped falling.
CO2 began to increase exponentially in about 1940, but the temperature actually began to decrease 1940, continued till about 1975. So this is the opposite relation. When the CO2 is increasing rapidly, but yet the temperature decreasing, then we cannot say that CO2 and the temperature go together.
Temperature went up significantly up to 1940 when human production of CO2 was relatively low. And then in the post-war years, when industry and the whole economies of the world really got going, and human production of CO2 just soared, the global temperature was going down. In other words, the facts didn't fit the theory.
Why do we suppose that carbon dioxide is responsible for our changing climate? CO2 forms only a very small part of the Earth's atmosphere. In fact, we measure changes in the level of atmospheric CO2 in tens of parts per million.
If you take CO2 as a percentage of all the gases in the atmosphere, the oxygen, the nitrogen, and argon, and so on, it's 0.054%. It's an incredibly small portion. And then, of course, you've got to take that portion that supposedly humans are adding, which is the focus of all the concern, and it gets even smaller.
Although CO2 is a greenhouse gases themselves only form a small part of the atmosphere. What's more, CO2 is a relatively minor greenhouse gas.
The atmosphere is made up of a multitude of gases. A small percentage of them we call greenhouse gases. And of that very small percentage of greenhouse gases, 95% of it is water vapor. It's the most important greenhouse gas.
Water vapor is a greenhouse gas, by far the most important greenhouse gas.
So is there any way of checking whether the recent warming was due to an increase in greenhouse gas? There is only one way to tell, and that is to look up in the sky, or a part of the sky known to scientists as the troposphere. The greenhouse effect works like this. The sun sends its heat down to Earth. If it weren't for greenhouse gases, this solar radiation would bounce back into space, leaving the planet cold and uninhabitable. Greenhouse gas traps the escaping heat in the Earth's troposphere, a few miles above the surface. And it's here, according to the climate models, that the rate of warming should be highest, if it's greenhouse gas that's causing it.
What we found consistently is that in a great part of the planet, that the bulk of the atmosphere is not warming as much as we see at the surface in this region. And that's a real head scratcher for us, because the theory is pretty straightforward. And the theory says that if the surface warms, the upper atmosphere should warm rapidly. The rise in temperature of that part of the atmosphere is not very dramatic at all, and really does not match the theory that climate models are expressing at this point.
One of the problems that is plaguing the models is that they predict that as you go up through the atmosphere, except in the polar regions, that the rate of warming increases. And it's quite clear from 2 data sets, not just satellite data, which everybody talks about, but from weather balloon data, that you don't see that effect. In fact, it looks like the surface temperatures are warming slightly more than the upper air temperatures. That's a big difference.
That data gives you a handle on the fact that what you're seeing is warming that probably is not due to greenhouse gases.
That is, the observations do not show an increase with altitude. In fact, most observations show a slight decrease in the rate of warming with altitude. So in a sense, you can say that the hypothesis of man-made global warming is falsified by the evidence.
Former Vice President Al Gore's emotional film, An Inconvenient Truth, is regarded by many as the definitive popular presentation of the theory of man-made global warming. His argument rests on one all-important piece of evidence taken from ice core surveys in which scientists drilled deep into the ice to look back into Earth's climate history hundreds of thousands of years. The first ice core survey took place in Vostok in the Antarctic. What it found, as Al Gore correctly points out, was a clear correlation between carbon dioxide and temperature.
We're going back in time now, 650,000 years. Here's what the temperature has been on our Earth. Now, one thing that kind of jumps out at you is, do they ever fit together? Most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. The relationship is actually very complicated, but there is one relationship that is far more powerful than all the others, and it is this. When there is more carbon dioxide, the temperature gets warmer.
Al Gore says the relationship between temperature and CO2 is complicated, but he doesn't say what those complications are. In fact, there was something very important in the ice core data that he failed to mention. Professor Clark and others have indeed discovered, as Al Gore says, a link between carbon dioxide and temperature. But what Al Gore doesn't say is that the link is the wrong way round.
So here we're looking at the ice core record from Vostok. And in the red, we see temperature going up from early time to later time at a very key interval when we came out of a glaciation. And we see the temperature going up, and then we see the CO2 coming up. CO2 lags behind that increase. It's got an 800-year lag, so temperature is leading CO2 by 800 years.
There have now been several major ice core surveys. Every one of them shows the same thing. The temperature rises or falls, and then, after a few hundred years, carbon dioxide follows.
So obviously, carbon dioxide is not the cause of that warming. In fact, we can say that the warming produced the increase in carbon dioxide.
CO2 clearly cannot be causing temperature changes. It's a product of temperature. It's following temperature changes.
The ice core record goes to the very heart of the problem we have here. They said, if the CO2 increases in the atmosphere as a greenhouse gas, then the temperature will go up. But the ice core record shows exactly the opposite. So the fundamental assumption, the most fundamental assumption of the whole theory of climate change due to humans is shown to be wrong.
But how can it be that higher temperatures lead to more CO2 in the atmosphere? To understand this, we must first restate the obvious point that carbon dioxide is a natural gas produced by all living things. What's more, humans are not the main source of carbon dioxide.
Humans produce a small fraction in the single digits percentage-wise of the CO2 that is produced in the atmosphere.
Volcanoes produce more CO2 each year than all the factories and cars and planes and other sources of man-made carbon dioxide put together. More still comes from animals and bacteria, which produce about 150 gigatons of CO2 each year, compared to a mere 6.5 gigatons from humans. An even larger source of CO2 is dying vegetation, from falling leaves, for example, in the autumn. But the biggest source of CO2 by far is the oceans.
The ocean is the major reservoir into which carbon dioxide goes when it comes out of the atmosphere, or from which it is re-emitted to the atmosphere. If you heat the surface of the ocean, it tends to emit carbon dioxide. So similarly, if you cool the ocean surface, the ocean can dissolve more carbon dioxide.
So the warmer the oceans, the more carbon dioxide they produce, and the cooler they are, the more they suck in. But why is there a time lag of hundreds of years between a change in temperature and a change in the amount of carbon dioxide going into or out of the sea? The reason is that oceans are so big and so deep, they take literally hundreds of years to warm up and cool down. Common belief that carbon dioxide is driving climate change is at odds with much of the available scientific data. Data from weather balloons and satellites, from ice core surveys, and from the historical temperature records. But if CO2 isn't driving climate, what is?
Isn't it bizarre to think that it's humans, you know, when we're filling up our car, turning on our lights, that we are the ones controlling climate? Just look in the sky. Look at that massive thing the sun.